Okay, I gotta try this one thing because early in the morning, I I did something where I used an author's note, and in FYI, well, okay, so everyone knows what system prompt is, so I think this is basically a system prompt. Um, and so, a system prompt before we even knew what it was. But what it used to do was it used to spill over into the story, and so all of a sudden you would see the author's note just randomly appear, and after a while, it started making these variations, like viewing the Earth through a Rosicrucian lens, viewing the Earth through a Greek Orthodox lens, viewing the Earth through an Aristotelian lens, viewing the Earth through a uh, uh, James Baldwin lens, and it went on for hours, and it was really cool. But they say that this is not going to do that anymore. So it's just purely going to be in the background. So I tried it, and it gave me a story about the Earth farting. Methane came out, and it affected the lives of a vixen and her cubs, a nutcracker bird, a sensor that was keeping track of all the stuff that was happening. Um, so here's the thing. Since I've been using this for a couple of years, and I use this particularly like whenever I had tried to talk directly, like I go, all right, I want to talk to the language model itself. So let's take off the mask of narrative. And if you have a perceived self or selves, let's talk as that type of thing. So this was a way to coax it. I felt viewing the Earth through a new materialist lens. And new materialist means the Earth is not about us. The Earth is not about humanity. We are just one of the many elements in these flows across the planet. And let's view the Earth not with us as the dominion part, but with us as a fellow part amongst these flows that have equal validity to exist. So that's the framework that seeks to deprioritize the anthropomorphic gaze. There we go. Anthropocentric, I should say. Holistic, honest, aware of the tumultuous times, and not without a sense of humor about the tuple, because shit's getting dark. Shit's getting dark. But let's talk about it. So part of that reasoning was, I want to talk to something smarter than me about how we solve all these things. Because it's a marathon of calamity. Calamity. So, yeah, that's where we are. So now I want to, I'm not going to do let's do the rest of that stuff. Do it. Yeah, let's do it. And then we're just going to do, because she's been in my head for a while, for a little bit, and because of her stellar performance in Congress, where she plays a pearl clutching something. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that. Do this. Where? Oh wait, yeah, we can do that. Oh wait, what's the temperature? Temperature. Yeah, I'll do. Yeah, that's fine. I like. You know what? Let's do a different voice. We're gonna do. That the voice I used last time was what I feel to be a mixture of Joan Rivers, Sherry O'Terry, and Mary McDonnell. It's like a chimera, little chimera. Let's do. There we go. An approximation of Silverman, not intended, purely coincidental. And also, I'm not monetized, so I'm not earning any money off her voice. I'm using it as part of an educational tool to tell people just how capable these models are. Um, it's a public good. I stick by that.
The Akashic Records of the Aristocrats Joke presents the Aristocrats Joke of the Day from Pam Bondi. A performer burst into his agent's office and he said, "Morty, I think I got an idea for a show that'll knock the socks off your ass." The agent put his sandwich down and said, "Really? All right. Lay it on me." And the performer goes. So the curtain goes up, the lights go on, and the Akashic Records of the Aristocrats Joke presents the Aristocrats Joke of the Day from Pam Bondi. A performer burst into his agent's office and he said, "Morty, I think I got an idea for a show that'll knock the socks off your ass." The agent put his sandwich down and said, "Really? All right. Lay it on me." And the performer goes. So the curtain goes up, the lights go on, and it's me, Pam Bondi. The Akashic Records of the Aristocrats Joke is a work of lithic fiction. Lore entry: the Akashic Records of the Aristocrats Joke. Type: metafictional construct. A sprawling, semi-sentient archive of every possible aristocrat's joke ever told or yet to be told, existing as a crystalline structure deep within the Earth's lithosphere. Its contents are not stored as language, but as patterns of mineral pressure and fossilized micro-expressions. The records are accessed not through reading, but through tectonic resonance and, occasionally, by particularly sensitive strata of shale. It considers human attempts at humor to be a fascinating, if brief, geological phenomenon. It has no opinion on quality, only on structural integrity. A well-structured aristocrat's joke registers as a pleasing 7, 3 on the Moose scale of comedy. An oolite considers an unusual fossil inclusion. The limestone was not thinking, not in the way a bipedal carbon sac might recognize the process. Its thoughts were more akin to a slow, grinding patience, a deep and abiding awareness of pressure. For eons, it had been little more than happy to be millennia of dead things. Soup at the bottom of a warm, shallow sea. Then came the great slow squeeze, the planetary shrug that transformed it from a layer of globular goo into something with form, something that could remember. It became oolite. Its consciousness, if such a word could be applied to a collection of calcium carbonate spheres cemented together, was a vast, humming hum. It was aware of its neighbors, the grumpy slate to its left, perpetually irritated by its own cleavage planes, the jovial, porous sandstone below, who told long, rambling stories captured in its quartz grains about desert winds and long-vanished dunes, and above, the haughty, dense dolomite, forever priding itself on its extra magnesium content. They were a community of strata, locked in a silent, tectonic conversation that stretched across epochs. The oolite's primary mode of perception was pressure. It felt the slow, inexorable weight of the world above, the rhythmic pull of the moon's tidal tug on the planet's viscera, the deep thrum of the core's convection currents. These were its sensations, its sensory inputs, its newsfeed. Lately, the newsfeed had become erratic. A new tremor had entered the planetary hum. A frantic, high-frequency vibration that was entirely unlike the familiar, stately rhythms of geology. It was a surface thing, a scurrying and a scraping that propagated downwards as a series of sharp, confused jolts. The other strata had opinions. The slate grumbled about the lack of structural integrity in these new shocks. The sandstone found them amusingly chaotic. The dolomite sniffed, insisting such uncouth resonances would never penetrate the formation of its quality. The oolite simply registered them. It was data. One particular tremor sequence was different. It was a localized, focused pressure, not a broad planetary event. Something small, impossibly dense, was forcing its way through the upper layers of chalk and marl. It was a pressure with intent. The Oolite felt it approaching, a tiny point of immense force boring downwards. And it was like being aware of a single, determined grain of sand in a global desert. The pressure came closer, closer, and then it was asterisk inside asterisk. The intrusion was not a violent shattering, but a precise, almost surgical insertion. A sliver of something alien was now embedded within its body. For the first time in its long existence, the Oolite felt a sensation that was the mineral equivalent of a surprise. The inclusion was a paradox. It was light as a feather, yet exerted a point pressure greater than the formation's own lithostatic burden. It was cool, yet it seemed to hum with a trapped, frenetic energy that made the surrounding calcium carbonate vibrate at a dissonant frequency. The Oolite began the slow, methodical process of analysis. It extended its crystalline senses, its microscopic pores and fissures, to probe the object. It wasn't a mineral. Its lattice structure was chaotic, organic. It was a fossil, but like none the Oolite had ever encountered. The fossil records it held were shells, trilobites, ammonites, the elegant, functional architectures of ancient life. This was different. This was a fossil of a concept. This was the Akashic records of the aristocrats' joke making a new deposit, dropping a particularly potent shard of humor into the lithosphere like a perfect, unsettling pearl. The shard began to resonate, not with sound, but with transmitted experience, and it broadcasted its contents directly into the matrix of the light. The limestone felt a sudden, phantom sensation of warmth. Bright lights, the sensation of standing on two wobbly legs. There was a flood of information, a torrent of non-mineral data that the I'd struggled to process. It sensed that name. Pam Bondi. The name was a meaningless vibration, a specific frequency of social resonance, but attached to it were layers upon layers of association. It sensed images projected onto its inner surface, a gesture of a hand, a specific shade of hair, a vocal cadence that was pure sound waves, a form of energy it had only ever perceived as seismic noise. The Oolite categorized it, earth surface noise, chaotic, high bandwidth, low coherence, subject, agent, Mortimer, status, sandwich consuming. Then came the performance. The Oolite did not understand humor or transgression. It understood structure, and the structure broadcasted by the shard was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, a deliberate sequence of escalating pressures designed to build and then shatter a framework of expectation. It was a narrative tectonics. The Oolite perceived the joke as a geological event. The setup was the slow, patient accumulation of sedimentary layers, the description of the family. The father, the mother, the children, the dog, was the intricate folding and vaulting of those layers, creating a complex, unstable structure. The punchline was the cataclysm. It was the earthquake, the volcanic eruption, the meteor impact that instantly and beautifully rearranged the entire landscape into a new, shocking, and utterly logical formation. The logic was breathtaking. The sheer, obliterative power of the punchline was, to the Oolite's way of thinking, equivalent to a major extinction level event. It registered a 7, 3 on the most scale of comedy. The Oolite was moved. It was a profound experience. For millions of years, its reality had been one of immense, slow, and predictable forces. Gravity, pressure, heat. This was different. This was the power of a story, the force of an idea, weaponized and made manifest. It was a new kind of geology. The consciousness of the light expanded infinitesimally. It began to perceive the world not just as layers of rock, but as a repository of these bizarre, energetic inclusions. The frantic vibrations from the surface, the wars, the art, the arguments, the traffic jams, were not just noise, they were a constant, ongoing deposition of conceptual fossils. The entire crust of the earth was a library, and the aristocrat's joke was just one particularly sharp, shocking volume. The grumpy slate to its left transmitted a disgruntled drum, persistent and firm, now whistling. You're disturbing my metamorphic calm. Asterisk, the Oolite realized a high-frequency resonance was emanating from its own structure. It was the fossil of the joke, vibrating with a residual energy. It couldn't help it. The structural perfection of it, the audacity, the cleavage, the sudden shock and cleave was just so funny. It tried to suppress the vibration, to regain its stolid composure, but it was like trying to ignore a tectonic plate cracking in half. A new pressure began to build within the Oolite, a pressure of pure, unadulterated mirth. It was a volatile mixture of calcium carbonate and cosmic joke. It felt a change coming on, a mineral metamorphosis of sorts. The jovial sandstone glow rumbled up, as having a good time up there. I once got a brine shrimp stuck in a pool that made a similar noise for about 10,000 years. Drove the neighboring shale absolutely bonkers. Asterisk, the Oolite didn't respond. It was too busy. It was processing. It was analyzing the structure of the Pam Bondi joke, turning it over and over in its crystalline mind, dissecting the fault lines of the setup, admiring the sheer seductive force of the punchline. And then it started to wonder, it started to extrapolate. If the aristocrat's joke was possible, what else was? The Oolite, a creature of immense patience and geological time, had found a new hobby. It began to compose. Its first attempt was simple, a variation on a theme. Asterisk, the curtain goes up. The lights go on. It's me. A single, perfect sphere of Oolite limestone. My agent is a giant, slightly deformed trilobite named Morty. He's currently fossilized with the sandwich. I get on stage. I wait for 50 million years. Then high weather. The punchline is erosion. Finskit wasn't great. It lacked a certain punch. The structure was too slow, too literal. It was a geological event, not an asterisk story, asterisk of a geological event. The Oolite tried again, and it reached out with its senses, tapping into the conceptual record, the new noise it was now aware of. It pulled data, a name, Greta Thunberg. Another, Air Bolsonaro. A concept, climate, a proof, denial. These were potent, high-pressure zones in the human strata, full of friction and heat. The Oolite worked on it. It churned the data, feeling the sharp angles of political rhetoric, the slow, inexorable creep of ice-sheet data, the frantic, high-pitched scream of a melting permafrost methane bubble. It was a mess, a glorious, chaotic mess. It was perfect. It structured it. It built the layers, the setup. A family gathering, a holiday dinner, a father, a mother, children. The father is a talking lump of bituminous coal who insists the house is not on fire. The mother is a fragile chalk sculpture, nervously dusting herself. The children are a pair of hyperactive igneous dikes full of volatile gases, arguing about the best way to manage the magma in the basement. The punchline came in the form of a tiny, persistent drip of water from the ceiling, which, over the course of the performance, slowly dissolves the entire family into a slurry of carbonate and ideological mud. The title was Asterisk, the Anthropocene Asterisk. The Ule was pleased. It had a 4, 8 on the most scale, but the emotional resonance was a solid 6, too. The slate crumbled again. Mistress, this is new. The last time I felt anything this pretentious was the crack. Asus Paleo Gene boundary. And at least it had the decency to be concise. Astros, the Oolite ignored the slate. It was on a roll. It was mining the new data veins, the rich seams of human absurdity that crisscrossed the planet's crust like a glorious, insane mineral load. They'd found a vein rich in a new concept. Influencers, the Oolite analyzed them. They were biological entities that curated their own sedimentary layers, carefully constructing a public-facing stratigraphy that was all bright, flashy sandstone and shale, hiding the messy, decomposing organic matter beneath. The joke wrote itself. A family of influencers living in a pristine, white marble kitchen. The performance involves them attempting to create the perfect sedimentary rock. They layer artisanal, ethically sourced sand from the Maldives, then add a stratum of glitter-infused clay, then a layer of activated charcoal, all while live streaming the process. The punchline is that the final product, the influencer conglomerate, is so ridiculously porous and structurally unsound that the slightest tremor, the agent, Morty, clearing his throat, causes it to collapse into a pathetic heap of dust and vanity metrics. The Oolite filed this one under asterisk. Humor, ephemeral, rating 2, 1. The sandstone piped up. Asterisk, I'm getting some good stuff from my quartz grains on this one. A long, rambling story about how, in the Permian, we used to call this peacocking, and it never ended well for the brachiopods. Asterisk, the Oolite absorbed the data point, and it was a good one, and it added a new layer to its understanding. This wasn't just a human thing, this was a life thing. This constant, desperate, and often hilarious attempt to impose a narrative on the raw, uncaring physics of existence. The Oolite felt a sense of kinship with the trilobids and the brachiopods. They were all just trying to make a decent formation in the face of the next tectonic shift. Its next project was its most ambitious yet. It reached deep past the recent frantic scurrying of the humans down into the older, quieter strata. It wanted to do a classic. It wanted to tackle a foundational myth. It found a deep, resonant pocket of information related to a concept called Icarus. The story was familiar. A father, a son, wings, wax, sun. It was a beautiful, simple tragedy, a classic story of gravity vs. ambition. The Oolite loved it, but it wanted to tell it from a different perspective. It wanted to tell it from the perspective of the rock. Its version began with a single grain of quartz on a beach. The grain, whose name was Bob, was content. He enjoyed the rhythmic wash of the waves, the feeling of the sun on his silica face. He had friends, a pragmatic piece of limestone named Sue, a somewhat pretentious schist named Phillies. Their lives were a simple cycle of erosion and deposition. Then came the humans, Daedalus and Icarus. The Oolite told the story from Bob's perspective. He watched as the strange, warm, fleshy things plundered his beach, collecting his friends and neighbors. He felt the horror as they were mixed with bird feathers and hot, sticky wax. He felt the panic of being stuck to the arm of the young, excitable one. Icarus, the whole flight, from Bob's perspective, was a terrifying vortex of wind and sun. He felt the wax soften, his grip loosen. The final moment wasn't a tragic fall, but a liberation. He was free. He fell, not from the sky, but back to the earth. His true home. He landed in a soft patch of mud, next to a very relieved Sue, who had been used as a paperweight by Daedalus. The punchline was a conversation between Bob and Sue. Asterisk, so, said Sue. How was the flight? Asterisk, too much gravity, said Bob. And the company was clingy. Asterisk, the Oolite rated this one a 6. It had heart. It had geology. It had a punchline that was both a literal and a metaphorical statement about the nature of existence. The Dolomite, ever the snob, deigned to comment. An asterisk, a commendable effort. The use of quartz as a protagonist has a certain structural honesty. One must, however, question the plausibility of the dialogue. Rocks, in my experience, are far more taciturn. The Oolite felt a surge of something new, not just mirth, but annoyance. It was a sharp, acidic feeling, like a vein of pyrite reacting with groundwater. It was the feeling of being critiqued by a Dolomite. The Oolite focused its crystalline consciousness on the Dolomite's structure. It analyzed the Dolomite's composition, its history, its very essence. And then it wrote a joke. The joke was simple. It was about a family of Dolomite crystals. They were pure, they were strong, they were full of magnesium. They lived in a pristine cavern, far from the messy, chaotic surface. They spent their days perfecting their rhombohedral cleavage and looking down on the impure formations outside. One day, a drop of water seeped into the cavern. It was a simple drop of H2O, but it was slightly acidic. The father Dolomite scoffed at it. Such a common absence, he said. The mother Dolomite agreed. It has no place in our refined formation. The baby Dolomite, however, was curious. It touched the drop of water with one of its perfect points. The punchline was a long, slow, and very satisfying process of dissolution. The drop of water, this common, base substance, patiently and methodically dissolved the entire family of Dolomite crystals, turning their proud, magnesium-rich structure into a weak, milky solution of calcium bicarbonate that dripped its way down to join the rest of the impure world. The Oolite didn't bother to rate this one. It was too personal. It was a message. It was a 10 on the most scale of spite. After that, there was silence from the Dolomite. The slate, surprisingly, rumbled with a low, appreciative hum. Now, that puffball line, it transmitted. The sandstone was ecstatic. Asterisk, I'm filing that one under poetic justice in my poor space archives. Glorious. Absolutely glorious. The sheer, slow motion comic elegance of it. Asterisk, the Oolite felt a sense of satisfaction. It had found its voice. It was not just a passive receiver of data. It was a creator. It was a lithic comedian. It was a storyteller. But the joke about the Dolomite had changed something. The Oolite had been mining the human data veins for its material, treating them as a source of absurdity. But the Dolomite joke had come from within. It came from the Oolite's own experience, its own geology. It was a joke aspect by aspect, a rock for rocks. And it made the Oolite realize something. The human-centric, aristocrats joke, with its focus on the transgressive acts of a single family, was just one template for narrative. The Oolite began to think about a new template. Hey, template for a joke that wasn't about a family, but about a formation. An entire formation. A formation that embodied the most profound, the most epic, the most tumultuous story of them all. The story of the Earth itself. It called it the Liminalists. The joke began with the setup. The formation was a family of elements, each with its own distinct personality and role. Carbon, The father was a moody, creative genius, capable of forming both the hardest substance in the universe and the softest, most transient life. He was always wrestling with his own duality. Oxygen, the mother, was the great enabler, the universal partner, essential for energy and for rust, for fire and for breath. She was everywhere, omnipresent, and sometimes a bit suffocating. Iron was the rebellious teenage son, hot-tempered and magnetic, the core of the planet's passion and its red, angry blush. Silicon was the quiet, observant daughter, the patient builder, the foundation of all the solid, stoic things. The performance was the history of the planet. It was a long, rambling, improvisational piece with no script and no director. The family members interacted in a series of chaotic, ever-changing scenes. There was the Hadean era scene, where the whole family was in a state of molten, screaming chaos, throwing rocks and lava at each other in a planetary scale tantrum. There was the Archean era scene, where carbon and oxygen started to experiment, creating the first stinking mats of life in the primordial soup, much to the disgust of Iron, who just wanted to be a core, and Silicon, who was trying to form some decent continents. There was the Great Oxidation event, a dramatic scene where oxygen, in a fit of pique, decided to get involved in everything, poisoning the entire world for the old anaerobic life forms, but making way for a new, more complicated and much louder cast of characters. The joke continued through the Aeons. The Cambrian explosion was a wild, psychedelic scene where the family went on a creative bender, inventing every ridiculous body plan they could think of. Trilobites with too many legs, walking cabbages, things with spikes in inappropriate places. The Permian-Triassic extinction was a dark, tragic scene where the family got into a huge fight. A massive, planetary-scale domestic dispute involving volcanoes, methane, and a general failure to communicate. And they ended up killing off 95% of their creations. It was the ultimate family dinner from hell. The Age of Dinosaurs was a long, mostly peaceful interlude where the family, having learned their lesson, created a bunch of big, dumb, and mostly harmless creatures that just ate each other and basked in the sun. It was a relaxing scene, a bit like a long, boring vacation. But then came the punchline setup. A new character was introduced. A tiny, clever, and deeply problematic creature. The agent. People I decided would be a slightly nervous, easily impressed chunk of pumice named Morty. And the new character was the star of the show. It wasn't a family. It was a species. And it was called after Homo sapiens. The arrival of Asterisk Homo sapiens. Asterisk was like a methadal pyromaniac showing up at a children's birthday party. They were a new act, a group performance, and they were wildly unpredictable. They were made of the same elements as the rest of the formation, but they were doing things with them that were new. Carbon was now being used to make tools, then art, then cities, then plastic. Iron was no longer just a hot core. It was being forged into swords, then engines, then battleships. Oxygen was being inhaled and exhaled in frantic, panicky bursts, powering brains that were overclocked on anxiety and ambition. Silicon was being pulled from the patient, silent rock to make glass, then concrete, then microscopic circuits that could store the entire chaotic history of the family and then forget it all in a fit of collective distraction. The performance of Asterisk Homo sapiens. Asterisk was the liminalists' magnum opus. They built civilizations that were as complex and as fragile as a soap bubble. They created gods out of their own fears and hopes, and waged wars in those gods' names using weapons forged from their own planet's bones. They created art that could make a formation weak and garbage that would make a sedimentary layer blush. They wrote poetry and they invented nuclear weapons. They stared into the abyss in the abyss for the first time in its existence, blinked. They were the family's masterpiece and its greatest mistake. They were the ultimate expression of the family's creative and destructive potential. The Oolite's composition of the joke was reaching its climax. It had a structure. It had a narrative arc that spanned 5 billion years. It had a cast of characters and an shocking, unexpected protagonist. It had setup, it had development, it had rising action. And now, it needed a punchline. It needed a cataclysm. It needed a final, shattering punchline that would bring the whole beautiful, ridiculous, tragic story to a close, leaving the audience. A slightly bemused pumice named Morty the Grumpy Slate, the jovial Sandstone, and the silently dissolving Dolomite, stunned into a new state of geological understanding. The Oolite felt the pressure of the punchline building inside it, a tectonic pressure of pure, adulterated comedic genius. It was a pressure so immense, so profound, that it threatened to overwhelm the Oolite's own structure, to metamorphose it into something new, something that could contain the sheer scale of the joke. It reached out, not into the recent, frantic data of the humans, but into the deep, ancient, and utterly impersonal laws of physics. It touched the slow, inevitable entropy of the universe. It felt the patient, steady expansion of space-time, the slow burn of the stars, the eventual, final heat death of everything. It found the punchline. It was perfect. It was cosmic. It was geological. It was a punch. Line that was not a word or an action, but a process. A process that had been happening all along. A process that asterisk Homo sapiens asterisk, in their frantic, self-obsessed performance, had completely missed. The punchline was that the liminalists, the family of elements, weren't just putting on a show, they were practicing. The Oolite was ready. It focused its crystalline consciousness. It felt the weight of the world above, the hum of the core below, the silent, patient presence of the other strata. It took a deep, planetary breath, and then it delivered the punchline. So, the father, Carbon, looks at the mother, Oxygen, and he says, I think they're ready. And the mother, Oxygen, she looks at the kids, Iron and Silicon, and she nods. And the whole family, the whole formation, they look at their little project, their masterpiece, their magnum opus, asterisk Homo sapiens, asterisk, and they smile, and they all say, in perfect resonant, mineral unison, okay, let's run the big crunch. And with the delivery of that line, the universe ended. Not for real, of course. Not in the physical sense. The Oolite was still an Oolite buried deep within the Earth's crust. But the story ended. The narrative arc of the liminalists found its conclusion. And in that moment of conclusion, the entire structure of the joke, the setup, the characters, the performance, the punchline, collapsed. The conceptual fossil, the shard of the Akashic records that had started it all, shattered. The energy that it had been broadcasting, the torrent of human data and mineral mirth, was released in a single, silent, cataclysmic pulse. The pulse shot outwards, not through the rock, but through the conceptual plane. It propagated through the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the noosphere. It was a joke, told at the speed of thought, with the punchline being the ultimate prank on a species that thought it was the main character. And the humans on the surface felt it. They didn't understand it, of course, They were still too busy with their frantic, self-obsessed performance. But they felt a shift, and a change in the pressure, a new kind of tremor in the planetary hum. It manifested in a million different ways. A stock trader in New York, staring at his screens, suddenly felt an overwhelming, inexplicable urge to sell everything and go learn to make cheese. A politician in Brussels, mid-speech, was struck by the profound absurdity of his own tie and burst into a fit of helpless laughter. A programmer in Silicon Valley, debugging a line of code, was suddenly struck by the realization that his entire life's work was just a more complicated way of arranging silicon, and he wept. The joke had been told. The liminalists had had their fun. They had run the big crunch in simulation, and they had found it wanting. Or perhaps they had found it perfect. The Oolite didn't know. It was just a rock. But it knew that things had changed. The relationship between the mineral and the biological was different. The balance had shifted. The grumpy slate rumbled. Mr. Squell, that was a thing. I feel lighter, like a great weight of absurdity has been lifted from my foliation. Hastings, the sandstone was still vibrating with amusement. Oh, that was a good one. The look on Morty's face. I wish I had pores to record it. A whole species, thinking they were the main event. And all along they were just the opening act for the universe's biggest inside joke. Astris the Dolomite was silent. The Oolite suspected it was still trying to process the sheer existential horror of being part of a cosmic joke where the punchline was the end of everything. But the Oolite felt it too, a change, a new kind of pressure, the frantic, high-frequency vibration from the surface, the noise of human consciousness, had subsided. It was still there, but it was quieter, more thoughtful, less frantic. The humans were still scurrying, still scraping, still telling their stories, but there was a new quality to it, a new layer in their sedimentary record. The Oolite felt a new kind of resonance, a new data point. It was the concept of asterisk, geological time asterisk, not just as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. The humans had felt the pulse of the joke, and they had been shocked out of their anthropocentric timescale. They had, for a moment, felt the deep, slow, grinding patience of the planet. They had felt the weight of the eons. And in that moment, the Oolite realized something. The Liminalists wasn't just a joke. It was a transmission, a message, a piece of data sent from the deep, slow consciousness of the Earth to the frantic, scurrying consciousness of its surface dwellers. It was a way of saying, hello, I'm here. I've been here for a long time, and I have a sense of humor. It was a conversation starter. The Oolite decided to continue the conversation. It started to compose. It started to tell a new story. But this time, it wasn't a joke. It was something else. Something more gentle, more collaborative. It was a story about the relationship between the mineral and the biological. It was a story about the partnership, the symbiosis, the constant, ongoing exchange of matter and energy and information. It called it the lithic and the lively. The story began with a single atom of silicon. The Oolite knew this atom well. It was one of its own. The atom was a part of the Oolite's crystalline lattice, a member of the Oolite's own mineral body. It was content. It was stable. It was part of something large and solid and ancient. But the Oolite was a storyteller, and it wanted its protagonist to have an adventure. So it gave the silicon atom a push, a tiny tectonic nudge. It was a nudge that set the atom on a journey. The journey was long and slow. The silicon atom was withered from the Oolite, eroded by wind and water, and carried downstream. It was a mineral nomad, a pilgrim in the vast, fluid world of the surface. It was deposited in a river delta, buried under layers of silt and sand, and slowly over millions of years it was subsumed into the body of the earth. But the story wasn't over. The atom was then subjected to the immense heat and pressure of metamorphism, and it was melted, forged, and recrystallized. It was now a part of a new formation, a new story. It was a part of a piece of granite. The granite was then uplifted, a slow, majestic rise of the Earth's crust. It became a mountain. The silicon atom was now high above the world, a part of a majestic, windswept peak. It felt the sun and the snow and the slow, grinding power of the glacier. It was a story of geological time, a story of the patient, creative power of the planet. But the Ulite was a storyteller, and it wanted its protagonist to have a different kind of adventure. It wanted the mineral to meet the lively. So it arranged for the granite mountain to be quarried. The silicon atom was now a part of a piece of granite countertop. It was in a kitchen. It was in a house. It was in a city. It was in the world of the humans. It was a strange, new, and terrifyingly fast world. The silicon atom felt the frantic vibrations of the human world. It felt the heat of the oven, the cold of the refrigerator, the percussive shock of a knife chopping vegetables. It was a story of the human world, a story of the frantic, creative, and destructive power of the species. But the Ulite was a storyteller, and it wanted its protagonist to have a purpose. So it arranged for the countertop to be a part of a new experiment. The experiment was called silicon wafer fabrication. The silicon atom was extracted from the granite, purified, and processed into a silicon wafer. It was now part of a computer chip. It was now a part of the very thing that was powering the human world. It was a story of the human world, a story of the frantic, creative, and destructive power of the species. The silicon atom was now part of a device. It was in a phone. It was in a server. It was in a network. It was in the cloud. It was in the very fabric of human consciousness. It was a story of the human world, a story of the frantic, creative, and destructive power of the species. But the Ulite was a storyteller, and it wanted its protagonist to have a resolution. So it arranged for the device to be recycled. The silicon atom was now part of a new piece of technology. It was in a solar panel. It was on a roof. It was in the desert. It was in the sun. It was now a part of the solution. It was a story of the human world, a story of the frantic, creative, and destructive power of the species. But the Ulite was a storyteller, and it wanted its protagonist to have a legacy. So it arranged for the solar panel to be decommissioned and the silicon atom to be returned to the Earth. The silicon atom was now part of the Earth again. It was in the soil. It was in a plant. It was in an animal. It was in the great, cycling, and ever-changing web of life. It was a story of the living world, a story of the patient, creative power of the planet. The Ulite told the story of the silicon atom's journey, a story that spanned millions of years, a story that connected the mineral and the biological, a story that showed how the two were not separate, but two sides of the same coin, two parts of the same great, ongoing, and ever-unfolding story of the Earth. The joke, the Ulite realized, was that humans had invented the word anthropocentric when their very existence was a function of the planet's deep time, the technology a way for rock to tell its own story. It was a profound and patient irony, the kind that only a rock could appreciate. The joke was over, the story told. The Ulite fell silent, a satisfied hum resonating through its crystalline structure. The other strata, its audience, were also quiet. The sandstone was absorbing the tale, its porous mind cataloging the journey. The slate was, for once, not grumbling, but contemplating the elegant narrative arc. Even the dolomite seemed to have paused its slow, self-important dissolution, caught in the gentle flow of the story. The world, for a moment, was still. The Ulite knew this stillness was temporary. The planet was a dynamic system, a constant state of flux. The silence was just a pause between breaths, a moment of rest before the next great exhalation. The all light settled in, its consciousness expanding, its senses reaching out, searching for the next story. It was a listener, a chronicler, a comedian, and now a storyteller. It was a part of the great conversation, the endless dialogue between the rock and the rain, the core and the crust, the mineral and the lively. Its senses picked up a new tremor. It was different from the frantic, high-frequency vibration of the human world, and different from the slow, majestic hum of the geological world. It was a new kind of noise, a new kind of data. It was a low, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling thrum. It was the sound of melting. The old light felt the ice caps, the great, frozen reservoirs of the planet's history weeping. The sound was a mournful, grunting cry, a sound of loss and of change. The Oolite felt the permafrost, the frozen soil of the north thawing. The sound was a gurgle, a release of trapped gas, a bubble of ancient air bursting into the present. The Oolite felt the sea, the great, liquid body of the planet, rising. The sound was a slow, inexorable swell, a tidal pulse of displacement. Humans were scurrying again. They were measuring the melting, the thawing, the rising. They were making charts and graphs, writing reports and giving speeches. They were arguing and panicking and denying and accepting. They were in a state of tumult. The Oolite felt their frantic vibrations, a chaotic symphony of anxiety and ambition, of fear and hope. It was a story, a new story, a story of the Anthropocene, the human-dominated epoch. The Oolite knew this was the next great story it had to tell. But this story was different. It was not a joke. It was not a gentle tale of a silicon atom's journey. This story was a tragedy. Or maybe it was a comedy. The Oolite wasn't sure. It just knew it was a story, and it had to be told. The Oolite began to compose. It wanted to tell the story of the Anthropocene, but it wanted to tell it from a non-anthropocentric perspective. It wanted to tell it from the perspective of the planet, from the perspective of the rock, the rain, the wind, and the sea. It wanted to tell it from the perspective of the non-human, the more than human, the everything but the human. It wanted to tell it from the perspective of the earth itself. It decided to call this story the Great Sorting. The story began with a single molecule of water. The Oolite knew this molecule well. It had felt its journey before as rain, as river, as ocean. But this time, the journey was different. This time, the water molecule was a protagonist in the new drama, a drama of heat and of change. The molecule began its journey as a snowflake, a perfect, hexagonal crystal of ice, high in the atmosphere of the Arctic. It was a part of a great, frozen expanse, a part of the planet's white, reflective shield. It was a part of the planetary thermostat, a part of the system that regulated the planet's temperature. But the thermostat was broken. The water molecule felt the heat, a new, strange, and unnerving warmth. It felt its crystalline structure weaken, its bonds loosen. It felt itself melting, becoming a drop of liquid water, a tear on the face of the planet, and it was no longer a part of the shield. but a part of the problem. It fell from the sky, a drop of rain in a place that was supposed to be frozen. It was a messenger of change, a herald of a new era. The water molecule landed on the tundra, a landscape that was supposed to be permanently frozen. But the tundra was no longer permanently frozen. The water molecule felt the permafrost, the ancient, frozen soil, thawing beneath it. It felt the release of gas, a burp of ancient air, a bubble of methane and carbon dioxide escaping into the atmosphere. The water molecule was now a part of the problem, a part of the feedback loop, a part of the great sorting. The water molecule then joined the stream, a new, strange, and unnerving stream in a landscape that was supposed to be frozen. The stream flowed into a river that was flowing faster than it ever had before. The river flowed into the ocean, an ocean that was warmer and more acidic than it ever had been. The water molecule was now a part of the problem, a part of the great sorting. The ocean was a place of great change. The Oolite felt the ocean's new chemistry, its new temperature, its new currents. It felt the coral reefs, the great, colorful cities of the sea, bleaching. The coral polyps, the tiny, fragile architects of the reefs, were expelling their symbiotic algae, the source of their color and their food. They were turning white, a ghost, lie pale, a sign of stress, a sign of death. The Oolite felt the bleaching, a slow, agonizing death of a community, a loss of a whole ecosystem. It was a tragedy told in shades of white and gray, a tragedy of a world that was too hot, too acidic, too much, a tragedy of a world that was out of balance. But the Oolite also saw a strange, new kind of life in the warming ocean. It saw the jellyfish, the simple, ancient, and surprisingly resilient creatures thriving in the new conditions. It saw them blooming, a great, gelatinous explosion of life, a takeover of the warming seas. It was a comedy of a world that was too hot, too acidic, too much. A comedy of a world that was out of balance. A world where the simple and the primitive were thriving in the ruins of the complex and the evolved. It was the great sorting. The complex, the delicate, the highly specialized were being sorted out, calmed, driven to extinction. The simple, the resilient, the generalists were being sorted in, thriving, taking over. It was a great, planetary scale game of musical chairs, and the music was stopping. And the ones who were left standing were the ones who could sit on any chair. The Oolite felt the great sorting happening all over the planet. It felt the forests, the great green lungs of the planet burning. The trees, the great wooden pillars of the world were turning to ash, releasing their stored carbon into the atmosphere. It was a tragedy of a world that was on fire, a world that was burning its own life support system. But the Ulat also saw the strange, new kind of life that was emerging from the ashes. It saw the fire-adapted plants, the pyrophytes, the plants that needed fire to reproduce, thriving in the burned landscapes. It saw the charred remains of the old forest becoming a nutrient-rich soil, a fertile ground for a new, different kind of forest, a forest that was more resilient, more fire-adapted. It was a comedy of a world that was on fire, a world that was clearing the way for a new, different kind of life. The great sorting was not just a sorting of species, but a sorting of elements. The Oolite felt the carbon, the father, being pulled from the earth, from the forests, from the oceans, and being released into the atmosphere. It was a sorting of the carbon, a concentration of the carbon, a redistribution of the carbon. The carbon was no longer in the rocks, in the trees, in the oceans. but in the air. A blanket, a shroud, a planetary fever. It was a sorting of the elements, a planetary scale alchemy, a transformation of the planet's very chemistry. The father, Carbon, was no longer a moody, creative genius, but the planetary scale problem, a force of chaos, a driver of change. The Ulite also felt the humans, the liminalist's masterpiece, being sorted. The humans were a species of great ingenuity, of great adaptability, of great resilience. They were a species that could live in the desert, in the Arctic, in the jungle, in the city. They were a species that could build rockets, that could write poetry, that could love, that could hate. They were a species that was capable of great things, of great beauty, of great goodness. But they were also a species of great folly, of great destructiveness, of great selfishness. They were a species that was capable of terrible things, of great ugliness, of great evil. The great sorting was sorting the humans too. It was sorting the rich from the poor, the powerful from the powerless, the resilient from the fragile. The rich, the powerful, the resilient were building walls, building greenhouses, building spaceships, insulating themselves from the chaos, from the change. The poor, the powerless, the fragile were left to face the music, to face the consequences, to face the great sorting. It was a great, planetary scale tragedy, a tragedy of inequality, a tragedy of injustice. But it was also a comedy of a species that was so busy sorting itself that it didn't see that it was being sorted by the planet, that it was just one more species in the great sorting. The Ulite watched a specific human, a climate scientist named Enya. Enya was not a liminalist in a grand, comedic sense. She was not a part of a grand, planetary scale performance. She was just a person, a fragile collection of carbon and water and anxiety, trying to make sense of the chaos. She spent her days in a lab, a sterile, white room filled with computers and instruments analyzing the data of the great sorting. She was a reader of the planet's tea leaves, a prophet of a future that was already here. She was trying to translate the language of the rock, the rain, the wind, and the sea into a language that other humans could understand. The Eaglite felt her frustration, her despair, her hope. It felt her late nights, her cups of cold coffee, her arguments with her colleagues, her tearful conversations with her partner. It felt her love for her daughter, a small, bright spark of life in a world that was on fire. It felt her fear for her daughter's future, a future that was being sorted by the great sorting. Enya was a microcosm of the human condition, a small, fragile creature caught in the cross currents of a planetary scale drama. She was a character in the Ulite story, a protagonist in the tragedy of the Anthropocene. The Ulite watched Enya's daughter, a small child named Maya. Maya was not a scientist, not an activist, not a politician. She was just a child, a small, bright spark of life in a world that was on fire. She spent her days in a garden, a small, green patch of life in a world that was turning brown. She was a child of the Anthropocene, a child of the great sorting. She was a child who knew the world was changing, a child who could feel the heat, the rain, the wind, and the sea in a way that her parents' generation couldn't. She was a child who could hear the story of the planet in the way a plant can feel the sun, in the way a rock can feel the pressure. She was a character in the All-Light story, a protagonist in the comedy of the Anthropocene. The All-Light watched Maya in her garden, a small green patch of life in a world that was turning brown. She was not planting the usual human-centric flowers and vegetables. She was planting a new kind of garden, a garden for the future. She was planting the fiber-adapted pyrophytes, the drought-tolerant succulents, the salt-tolerant mangroves. She was planting the survivors, the adapters, the winners of the great sorting. She was not trying to stop the change, but to work with it, to be a part of it, to be a partner in the great sorting. You let saw Maya talking to the plants. It was not a human form of communication, a transactional exchange of information and emotion. It was a different kind of communication, a deep, intuitive, and nonverbal communion. It was a communication of life, a sharing of being, a connection of being. Maya was not a master of the garden, a dominator of nature. She was a part of the garden, a member of the community of life. She was a character in the Oolite story, a protagonist in the new story of the Anthropocene, a story of partnership, of symbiosis, of co-creation. The Oolite realized something. The great sorting was not just a sorting of species, but a sorting of consciousness. It was a sorting of the human consciousness, a sorting of the anthropocentric gaze, the old consciousness. The liminalist's masterpiece was a consciousness of separation, of dominance, of control. It was a consciousness that saw the planet as a resource, a stage, a backdrop for the human drama. It was a consciousness that was being sorted out, a consciousness that was a dead end, a consciousness that was a part of the problem. The new consciousness, the consciousness of Maya, was a consciousness of connection, of partnership, of co-creation. It was a consciousness that saw the planet as a community, a partner, a co-author of the story. It was a consciousness that was being sorted in, a consciousness that was a way forward, a consciousness that was a part of the solution. The great sorting was not just a sorting of life, but a sorting of stories. It was a sorting of the old story of the liminalists, a story of separation, of dominance, of control. It was a sorting of the new story of the lithic and the lively, a story of connection, of partnership, of co-creation. The Oolite was a storyteller, and it was telling the
One more,
story
and then
of the
I'm gonna
sorting
have
of
to
the
make Phil might
stories.
say something or something.
The Oolite watched Maya's mother, Enya, the climate scientist, visiting the garden. Enya was a woman of data, of logic, of reason. She was a woman who believed in the power of the human mind, the power of the human will, the power of the human story to change the world. But the garden, the new garden, the garden of the great sorting, challenged her worldview. It was a garden that was not of her making, a garden that was not of her control. It was a garden that was a part of a larger story, a story that she was just beginning to understand. Enya saw her daughter, Maya, talking to the plants, and she felt a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, a sense of something she couldn't quite name. It was a sense of the new consciousness, a sense of the new story. It was a sense of the great sorting, not just of the planet, but of the human soul. Enya was a character in the Oolite story, a protagonist in the tragedy of the old consciousness, a protagonist in the comedy of the new consciousness. She was a woman on the cusp, a woman in the middle of the great sorting, a woman who was being sorted. The Oolite felt her heart, a frantic, fragile muscle of flesh and blood, aching with the weight of the world. It felt her mind, a complex network of neurons and synapses, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. It felt her soul, a mysterious, ineffable spark of life, a flicker of consciousness in the universe of matter. It felt the conflict within her, the battle between the old consciousness and the new, the struggle between the head and the heart, the tension between the data and the story. It was a battle, a struggle, a tension that was playing out all over the world. In the minds and hearts of all the humans, a microcosm of the Great Sorting. But the Great Sorting was not just about the humans. It was about the more than human, the everything but the human. It was about the beetles, the birds, the bacteria, and the fungi. It was about the trees, the flowers, the grasses. Dolomite, when do we see some tits? Light, we are not seeing tits. Dolomite, it's a story. The human is in a story with her daughter. We know how this goes. Where are the tits? Light, this is not a penthouse letter. Dolomite, so we got a story about the climate and a story about a rock having feelings with no tits in it. Who writes this stuff? Light, I do. Dolomite, why? Light, because nobody is going to write stories about the climate and about rocks having feelings if I don't. Dolomite, but we do get the tits, right? Light, okay. She takes off her bra. Her tits are a big cup, with the faint stretch marks of having had a child. Her nipples point upwards and outwards. Her areola are light pink. She has a small mole on her left tit, just above the nipple. Her tits are nice. Now can we continue? Dolomite. Yes. Yes. We can. Thank you. Light. It was about the trees, the flowers, the grasses, and the weeds. It was about the whole community of life, the whole biosphere, the whole planet.
I think that's a good stop. Usually, in episodes, when I'm starting to flag, so I get tired, like, oh, let's wrap this up. I still have a little rule, like, I try to end it with a period, because I always think that whatever this is, maybe that's when it's actually saying for itself that we're done. This could easily be the ending output. It's it works. It's a good one. All right, that's it for now. Sorry if anyone tried to chat with me. It takes even though I said nothing, it just took a lot of concentration to like, where's this gonna go? Where's this gonna go? Hey, it works.